Hello everyone, how are you? Pentagon says Ukrainian breakthrough is south made more Russian targets vulnerable to artillery after the rapid advance of Ukrainian forces in the south of the country. More Russian targets have come within the reach of Ukraine's artillery, CNN reported, on October 14, citing a high-ranking representative of the Pentagon. I will give you today's important developments. And I will examine what may occur on the map. If you say no to war, I would appreciate if you like the video and comment. Don't hold back your support and let's show our stance. According to the official, Ukrainian forces are continuing to advance on Russian forces in the north of Kherson Oblast. We have seen gains in the north of Kherson Oblast, now, really the line of advance for the Ukrainians, just north of the village of Mylov, and then extending essentially to the north and west with a number of small towns and villages that the Ukrainians have been able to clear of the Russians, the official stated. The United States is also seeing some gradual progress in the central part of the oblast. The official clarified that this is not about great progress, but partial. We are talking about kilometers, the official clarified. Earlier, the head of Kherson Regional Military Administration, Yaroslav Yanushevich, stated that since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the armed forces of Ukraine had liberated 75 settlements in Kherson Oblast. The head of the Joint Press Center of the Defense Forces of the South Operational Command, Natalia Gumenyuk, reported on October 7 that the area of the liberated territories in Kherson Oblast had increased to 500 square kilometers. We had our own front, 1 doctor and 400 lives saved due since the beginning of the hostilities. Most of the doctors left Izium. For 10,000 residents of the occupied city, there are only 24 medics left. They dare to work under the barrels of Russian machine guns. Overcoming the fear for their lives in the destroyed city, they had to look for food, water, and medicine. Despite everything, they continued to rescue the wounded and sick. Yuri Kuznetsov, a traumatologist of the Izium Department of Emergency Medical Care, did not have to choose to stay or evacuate. On March 6, during the massive shelling, he was on duty, and the next day no one came to replace him. So he was the only doctor in the hospital. And he could not leave Izium. On the other side of the Siversky Donets, which divides the city, was his family, a bedridden mother and a brother with the first group disabilities. At that time, there were 72 patients and employees in the hospital. Everyone went down to the basement. They organized an improvised operating room there. Kuznetsov did not know then that his round-the-clock duty would stretch for 4.5 months, and he would live at work until mid-July. Ring the occupation, Mommy, are they going to kill us? Olena Ryabenka, a paramedic at the Izium Department of Emergency Medical Care, lived on the other side of the river, just like Kuznetsov's family members. Bridges were destroyed at the beginning of March, her family was cut off from the city. Russians bombed so hard that she thought there was no one alive on that side of the river. She was very scared for her 4 children. Mommy, are they going to kill us? They asked. Olena held on so as not to cry and frighten the children even more. Only in the evening, when everyone was asleep, did she allow herself to cry. In addition to the bombs, Olena was terrified of hunger. All her life, her husband and she built a house for a large family and had no savings. They received Ukrainian wages on the cards even during the occupation, but it was impossible to withdraw cash. Grocery stores stopped working. Elena was happy that every year she planted 20 buckets of potatoes, had her own onions, beets, carrots, and preserved salads. She clearly understood. Her family would live as long as there was enough food in the cellar. In the worst times, Olena imagined how all the food would run out and the children would die of hunger in her arms. Olena was wrong. On the opposite side of Izium, her colleagues tried to resume work. There were 3 of them left at the ambulance service. After her shift on March 7, Nurse Tatiana Myznikova told the head of the ambulance service, Serhiy Botsman, that she would go home because she could no longer bear the shelling. Russian aviation leveled the city with the ground. However, she returned the next day. Botsman himself wanted to leave the city. But he stayed. Now he explains, when you visited a sick or injured person between shelling, you understood that it depends only on you. So all this was going somewhere. If we left, there would be no one to help. Meanwhile, the Russians established their power and began to purge. They also went to the hospital, searched the premises, and looked for something suspicious among the medicines. Doctors were ordered to take off their uniforms with chevrons with the coat of arms of Ukraine. No, we worked near Kharkiv, was the reply. Every time they went out on a call, they were checked at each checkpoint, their car, documents, and pockets were examined. In the hospital itself, traumatologist Kuznetsov did not discuss sensitive topics with the Russians. Especially after his colleague, a forensic medical expert, was shot because he argued with the occupier. They went around the houses. They went down to the basements, where people were hiding from the shelling, and asked who needed help. Due to hypothermia, many people fell ill with pneumonia. Then they collected the wounded after the shelling. And when Izium was cleared a little after the March battles, the drivers of the ambulance service repaired their cars and a month later went out on calls. At least 25 to 30 people were treated per day, says Botsman. There were so many patients that he no longer remembers whom he helped. People now approach him on the street and thank him. When the bridge was restored a month later, Botsman came to paramedic Olena Ryabenka and said, "Go to work, my dear." Olena kissed him and burst into tears of happiness. It was a miracle for her. She did not think that any of her colleagues survived. However, she was afraid to go to work. There were rumors in the city that people were being shot on the pedestrian bridge. The ambulance service had to work in the city without connection. When patients asked how to get in touch with them, the nurses jokingly replied, "Ring the bell." The phone did not work, so people walked, came on bicycles, and asked for help. They left notes with the addresses of the sick or wounded at checkpoints. They tried to catch the ambulance car. Putin is upset. Russia will run out of arms before Ukraine. Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine is clearly going very different than he, and most military analysts, thought it would. Now the Russian leader is facing an even bigger problem. He could run out of weapons at some point. What does that mean, Russia? Running out of weapons? Ben Wallace was asked by Sky News in an interview shared on Thursday if there a risk that Western allies are going to run out of weapons to support Ukraine first, compared to Russia. Wallace said in response that there was not. There isn't a risk, he said. He said this was the case because Ukraine's Western allies are not at risk of running out, unlike Russia, which has already isolated itself. Russia's ability to make and repair weapons and ammunition is tied up in a global supply chain that it has little current access to, he said. They need a supply chain, and large parts of their supply chain were not in Russia. They came from all over the world, including in Europe and including, indeed, even in Ukraine, he said. Ukraine's allies have imposed several waves of sanctions on Russia, cutting it off from key supplies, since the war began. What about Ukraine? But there have been reports that the West is reaching the limits of its capacity to supply Ukraine with ammunition, as the Wall Street Journal and CNBC reported. An assessment in September by the Center for Strategic and International Studies listed the stockpile status of 5 key weapons, including the famed HIMARS, as limited. Addressing these kinds of concerns, Wallace said, "We have the ability to refurbish and indeed manufacture a new supply chain, which is what we're doing right now." Thank you for listening. I will keep you informed of the hottest developments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.